It really irritates me that Gabe took so much time talking about threats to U.S. interests, and what I need to talk about are threats to U.S. interests. So we're going to go into this. It's a joke. So this is a product we published here about 6 weeks ago or thereabouts. If you're all familiar with the Heritage Foundation, we've had an index of U.S. economic, or index of economic, strength, right, or economic freedom for about the past 21 years or so. And we have three big areas. One is economics and foreign relations. Another one is social and domestic kinds of policies within the U.S. And then the third one is foreign relations and national security, military strength. And so this last fall, we published the Index of Culture and Opportunity, which looks at domestic U.S. issues. And this is the third of that triad, which is the Index of U.S. military strength. And this will be an annual publication. It assesses conditions within the and then since this is the inaugural one, it sets a baseline. And then in subsequent years, it'll do that assessment of what's going on in the world, which I'll explain in just a minute. And then did things get better or worse from the preceding year? So the idea is that we would have something, there we go, to use to inform the public debate and members of Congress. If you're talking about defense expenditures, there is no singular, consistent, year-on reference that anybody can use to say whether U.S. military posture, hard military power, is getting better or worse relative to U.S. interests in the world. Just a hodgepodge of things. And the QDRs and even the annual budget submissions become political documents based on the policy preferences of a given administration. So what we want to do is provide that kind of a benchmark for public utilization. The approach to this thing was, if you're going to talk about military power, how much is always the question, and how much to spend on it. You can't know how much unless you know what it is you're trying to defend. So we articulated the three vital national security interests that stay consistent over decades: defending the homeland, handling a major regional war where the U.S. has an interest because they're direct unilateral, or we've got friends and allies in the region, or ensuring that if we're big about trade, access to markets, resources, those kinds of things, then these commons areas, whether it's cyberspace now, outer space, maritime environment, et cetera, that you've got freedom of movement in that. So we looked at those and we thought, okay, well, who poses the level of threat that can actually challenge those vital national interests? And there's just a half a dozen actors, which I'll get to here in a moment. And where do those threats to U.S. interests coincide? And there's only three key regions in reality. That's Europe, the Middle East, and Asia Pacific. So what we wanted to do was assess each one of those areas, right? Friends and allies, or the stability of a region. Is it easy or difficult to operate there? What's the nature of the threat? Is Russia, rising, or is it declining? Are they behaving badly? Do they have capabilities? And then look at the U.S. military capability to address that, right? So do we have sufficient military power if diplomacy and economic initiatives fail, and you actually have to go to war, or you need to deter somebody from acting opportunistically against U.S. interests? Do you have enough of that to do what you want to do? So that was the underlying logic. So to really put this in perspective then, what we tried to do is kind of lay out the world in terms of the bad actors out there. So this is a great graphic that shows the militarization of the high north by Russia. They've reactivated a lot of old Soviet bases along the Arctic, as well as implementing new ones. Just last week, they announced a major deployment of air defense systems up north, and it's all predicated on this trade route going through the Arctic seas. They're going to make their claim first. They want to be the dominant power in the area. We've got very, very limited ability to respond to that. The Russians have something like 27 Arctic-capable icebreakers. The United States has 2. And when you look at where force postures are at, they're moving a lot of stuff up north. Nordic countries are very concerned. You've seen reports of increasing Russian submarine incursions in and around Finland and Norway and the like. The Baltics are very concerned about this animated response up into the northern areas and stuff. So it's an issue that we would need to be concerned about. If you look at North Korea and what they're doing in their neck of the woods and the increasing range of their ballistic missile capabilities, the proliferation of missile technologies in particular, and that's what a lot of the Iranian stuff is built on, Again, it's a very worrisome thing, right? So they can reach a very good part of the world, and even our own Northcom commander has talked about an ICBM capability being fielded by North Korea, that even though they haven't tested it, the belief is that it is workable and it reaches about half the United States. If we were to go to Iran, we just had a great presentation on its ballistic missile capabilities and the latest iteration of that, which pushes out to something like 3,700 kilometers. The characteristics of this particular missile make it an ideal delivery vehicle for a nuclear warhead, right? So to have that kind of range, the design characteristics, the size, the trajectory, et cetera, it's only designed to carry one thing, and that's a nuclear warhead. As you can see, it covers half of Europe, all the way over to the east of India, almost all of Central Asia and down into Africa. So if I were Israel, my teeth would be chattering. This is a real concern. And again, if they have a nuclear program, that agreement, pseudo-agreement framework says nothing about ballistic missile technologies. It says nothing about collaboration with North Korea or any of that stuff. So it wouldn't be hard for them having a delivery vehicle to deliver a nuclear weapon anywhere. As Gabe just got at a little bit earlier, this is the current nuclear club, and if you can envision the kind of proliferation that a nuclear armed round would have, you would have another 4 or 5 actors right there in the heart of the most unstable region on the entire planet. Probably not a good news story if this were to come about. And again, this should cause concern for the U.S., for Western Europe and other actors. Do you have the ability to deal with something like this? When we look back toward China, and you can see where their investments have gone, it's interesting to look at China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, what have you, where they're investing in capabilities. And they're great investments if you're fighting a local fight, which they are, whereas the U.S. has to project military power 4,000, 6,000, or 8,000 miles from home and sustain operations in that distant theater, where they're working on interior lines. If you're familiar with military lingo, they can base a lot of things on land that reach out to sea. We have to go from sea on to land. So it's inherently in their favor. That's why in defense studies and wargaming and all, you look to a 3 to 5 to 1 ratio, offense to defense, because it's difficult to get in there. Not accounting for Hawaii or perhaps Guam, every other military installation that the U.S. would use, every partner that we would rely on, is within the ballistic missile range and cruise missile range of what China already has fielded. So it's quite problematic, and they've been quite provocative in the East and South China Seas. And we certainly know the contest that's been going on with them in Japan. Japan and Korea don't get along, won't get along, never have gotten along. And so U.S. relationships in that region are bilateral instead of the potential for framing something like a NATO-type collective security agreement. And so we have to account for that in our own defense planning. If you go back to the Middle East, you talk about the flow of foreign fighters coming in. If you total the numbers coming out of Europe, this is a graphic put together by the Washington Post. I think the numbers are current as of January. About 6,000 EU passport-holding citizens flowing into Syria to support the Islamic State in their activities. Only 5,000 out of North Africa and only 5,000 out of the Middle East. So you've got this huge population of folks that, if not carefully watched by the European members, could flow back out of that region, more motivated, certainly with experience and training, carrying the jihad to other parts of the world. Again, it's an issue, it's a destabilizing issue, and it should draw America's attention in terms of our ability to deal with that. Going back out to Pakistan then, I only throw this slide up to show the nature of Islamist, violent, radical jihadi militant groups, terror organizations that operate out of Afghanistan and along that border area with Pakistan, attacking Pakistani military facilities. These aren't shopping mall attacks or local gendarmerie or what have you. They're going up against actual Pak military facilities. Why do we care? Pakistan's a nuclear power, and I'm a little skeptical of kind of the loose nuke scenario, but you could certainly envision a destabilization of the Pakistani government and the divided loyalties within the Pak intel, military, and government communities, and where that might go. So if there was a destabilizing thing, there is questionable control and use over Pakistan's nuclear inventory. How might India respond to that? You know, might something get into the hands of a militant group that would export it to somewhere other? So it's something, again, to be concerned about. So we looked at these kinds of threats, and we looked at the world that we would operate in, and we've got a fairly robust chapter that talks about friends and allies, and we looked at these regions of the world in terms of political stability, the posture of U.S. military forces, the alliance relationships we have, what is the ability of a friend or an ally to contribute to the fight. When you look at somebody like the UK, I mean, they're down to, what, 19 surface combatants in the whole Royal Navy. We've got about 2,800 fighter aircraft. Russia has about 1,500. Great Britain has 150. 150 strike aircraft in the whole British Air Force. And within 5 years, they're anticipating, based on their budget problems, down to 100, right? So when we look at these old-time, long-time friends and allies, if NATO target is 2% of GDP, only 4 of the 28 NATO members are spending at that level. Everybody else is down to 1.2, 1.3%, something like that. So again, if we're betting on other people stepping up to the plate, and our national security interests are dependent on that, it's probably a strategic vulnerability that we're willingly incorporating into the plan. When we look at the threat environment, the actors we looked at that rise to a level. So drug cartels in Mexico, it's a bad day. It's largely a law enforcement problem. They don't rise to the level of challenging a vital U.S. national interest. That's Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, the regional destabilizing challenge posed by terrorist organizations in the Middle East, and then the Afghan PAC problem that I just talked about. So we looked at them in 2 areas. One, behavior, which is kind of a surrogate measure for intent. You know, are you behaving badly? And then capability-wise, do you have the physical capability to follow through on your belligerent, provocative rhetoric, right? So I can talk about streets running red with blood, but if I don't have the actual physical, material ability, you know, to do that, who really cares what you're saying? So we looked at behavior and capability and scored them accordingly. Obviously for Iran, if they are able to mature their nuclear or even improve their ballistics and make better use of surrogates, and they would move to the left on that to a more worrisome level. So we looked and we scored that. So we looked at the scoring of the world as an operating environment, and then the threats. And then with that in mind, we looked at the U.S. military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and we looked at the entire nuclear infrastructure, that nuclear complex, so delivery, intellectual capital, physical infrastructure, innovation and design, et cetera, and we came out with these scores. So almost across the board, if we're looking, and this is what we have set as our benchmark, a 2-war capability plus a bit of strategic reserve, because not 100% of your force is available, you know, 100% of the time. 2-war capability is important, because if I only have one, I could self-deter, knowing that if I commit to a major regional contingency, then I've got nothing left in the barn, so it makes me hesitant to plow in. Or if it's so important that I do commit, I don't have resources to commit otherwhere, someplace else. So you could have a major competitor to the U.S. that views this as an opportunity and makes a move somewhere else. And we find ourselves busy in the Pacific, Russia goes into Eastern Europe. We find ourselves busy in the Middle East, Russia goes into Eastern Europe, or China becomes more provocative in the Western Pacific. So we thought this 2-war capability allows the U.S. military to handle one and provide at least deterrent value against anybody else, if not actually have to undertake 2 wars. And if you think back historically, we've been able to do that, right? So we were involved in Korea, or we were involved in the first Gulf War, or we were involved in Vietnam, and you still had the ability to hold off the Soviet Union globally and certainly in the European theater. So we've fallen off of that, and where we're at now is marginally able to handle that 2-war kind of commitment with no reserve capability whatsoever. And if you've been following the military readiness posture, only 1/3 of the Army meets Army requirements for being ready. The Marine Corps just recently announced that 1 out of 5 aircraft is not available for utilization. That's 20% of its air capability that is down. U.S. Navy actually needs a Navy of about 346 ships. Its target is 306. It has 275. By September, it will be down to 270 because we're decommissioning the last 5 frigates. And if their plan goes through with taking half of the cruisers offline, 11 of 22, you'd be down into the 260, 259 range. So under the Reagan era, we were building about 18 ships a year to account for, decommissioning, and you get to the end of the lifespan. The current 30-year shipbuilding plan for the Navy is about 8 ships a year. To get up to 306 ships, it would need about $20 billion a year in shipbuilding funds. Right now, it's funded at about 14 billion. So there's no way they're going to make the 300, 306 mark. So again, across the board, what we find is an aging force because modernization accounts just aren't funded. We're finding a shrinking force because the funding we do have buys fewer items that are inherently more expensive than any time in history. F-35 is 4 times as expensive as an F-16. Ships are more expensive. The Ford-class carriers at $15 billion, right? People are more expensive just because we've upped pay and benefits over the past decade or so. So we've got a shrinking and aging force that is less ready, and it becomes problematic. So if we keep that in mind and we look at historical defense spending, we're right at about, in constant dollars, where we've been at historically, about that $500 billion mark, right? But as I just mentioned, things are much more expensive, even accounting for inflation, than at any time in the past. So though that's a lot of money, a lot of it, almost half, goes to pay for manpower and the equipment, the end items, whether it's a tank, a ship, an airplane, or what have you that we're buying, is much, much more expensive. So I buy fewer and fewer of them, hence the shrinking of the force. If you looked at it as a percentage of GDP, on average, it's about 5.6%, accounting for the, peaks of wars and then the troughs of the post-war drop-off. We always cut defense spending by a third or a half following a war, and you find you've cut too much and you have to climb back up. So right now, it's about 5.6%. A healthy target in past administrations have been the low 4s. Right now, we're at 2.8. 16% of the federal budget, and yet the military is absorbing 50% of the Budget Control Act of 2011, sequestration. So it's not a good story. This is what I was just articulating. Half of the historical average for GDP, and the money we are spending buys fewer and fewer items because of the types of things we're spending, especially in an era with the American way of war, that if you want to minimize collateral damage and you don't have as few assets to apply against a problem, you really have to go precision. Precision is very expensive. Tomahawk's $1 million a shot. We fired, 120 of them or something on that one night into Syria? $120 million in the space of about 4 hours. So if we don't want the cost of precision, then we have to go with attrition levels, dumb bombs, and casualty rates and destruction of infrastructure and stuff dramatically goes up, and people usually aren't inclined to do that. This is one illustration I think I used the last time I briefed last fall about just these trends we've seen. The Army was building to 48 brigade combat teams, and that was its mark, to handle sustained operations, have a rotational base, et cetera. Right now, I think we're down to about 31 currently, and if sequester holds, we'll be down to 24 in just a few years. So half the Army that we thought we needed just a few years ago. I've already talked about the Navy ship count, 375 now, down to 250, possibly in the next year or so. And then you can see some of the other numbers. So the Marine Corps, they were at 27 battalions at one point in time. They're kind of holding on with their nails across the desk at about 21 battalions, and that's highly questionable as well. So what we're finding is a third to a half of the force is not ready for deployment and take on a major competitor in conventional operations. If you look at the various platforms that are currently in inventory, because we've been using them at such a high rate for constant operations, we're using up the lifespan on an airframe. You can only fly so many hours, drive so many miles for a tank, et cetera. So a third, a half, most of the military's equipment is getting toward the end of its lifespan, and fewer dollars are available to deal with that. So when you take the totality of all of that, we got lots of friends and allies still around the world, but they're even less capable than we are. Look at the budget picture in Europe and the socialist states that they've been creating, and they just don't have the money to apply against it based on their decisions. Japan is trying to become a normal country, and they're trying to figure out what that means in terms of projectable military power, et cetera. So they're stable, less capable. Threat actors are going through the roof in terms of modernization that Putin is trying to do of the Russian military, even at the expense of other economic activities. We've seen China with the dramatic rise of its expenditures, trying to get a blue water navy going. They've put 3 or 4 more new ballistic missile boats in the water. We certainly see what Iran's starting to do with the nuclear program, et cetera. So it's not a good picture from the bad guy size. I've already said, repeat many times now, that our own force is aging and shrinking and has a marginal ability to handle these 2 wars. And so the conditions seem to be ripe for somebody like Iran to really push the boundaries for Islamic State to do what it's doing, because there's nobody there to contain them. So that's basically the message of our index, the word we're trying to get out to staff and members on Capitol Hill and inform the public debate. And we're already in the throes of writing edition 2, which will be out this fall, and assessing whether things have gotten better or worse. I fear the trend is negative. It's always easier to go negative because it takes positive energy and more resources to climb out of a hole, and there doesn't seem to be the appetite for that in D.C. So happy to entertain any questions for the next, 10 minutes or so we might have, and I'm all yours.
Dakota, thanks. That's it's an extremely frightening presentation, I have to say, although also very concise. The one question I have before we open it up is, can you explain what overseas contingency operations funds are and what the significance is, in light of what you've just presented on, of the defense budget battle, where, as I understand it, in order to stay under the Budget Control Act caps, you had the base budget that did come in under the caps, but then you have the OCO funds that sort of technically, I guess, didn't really put it over, but there are implications for how those funds can be used. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Right. So the base budget says I got to pay salaries, I have to maintain infrastructure, I have to buy new things to replace old things that are going out of inventory. And then, surprise, a war pops up. You're flying more, so you have to buy fuel. You're dropping bombs, so you have to replace those things, munitions. You've got additional pay that goes with operating in hazardous areas. So there's just the costs go up dramatically when they're actually conducting wartime operations. And so what they did was, for these overseas contingencies, we need a separate line item in the federal budget to account for that. So we maintain a base budget to actually pay for the military we have under normal circumstances, and then the OCO, Overseas Contingency Operation Account, is the extra money needed to actually do things in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Nigeria, wherever else it is you might be operating at, right? So when the Budget Control Act came into play, it said, look, super committee didn't work, we need to find $1 trillion+ savings across the federal budget. Half of that, $500 billion, will be applied against the military, and there are legal limits to how much you can spend for that base budget for the military. The OCO account exists outside of that Budget Control Act framework. So what people have been doing for the past few years is saying, if I can't legally plus up the baseline account to account for this aging and shrinking kind of military, maybe I can use this OCO thing, this almost is like a gimmick or a slush fund or whatever, and I plus that up and it helps pay for gas and bullets. But maybe I can rationalize, well, my aging tank got destroyed on the battlefield, and I use OCO money to pay for things that critics of OCO spending would say really needs to be in the baseline account. But the law forbids me from raising the baseline. So the current debate here on Capitol Hill was, okay, I'll request 525 or 530 billion for the baseline. The law won't let the actual spenders actually spend that kind of money. So for the military DOD part, it's limited to 499, I think, so right at 500 billion. But outside of that legal limitation, we'll plus up the OCO to $90 billion and just use that as a workaround, hoping that at some point in the future we can change the framework of the Budget Control Act or eliminate it or something along those lines. So right now, between the House and the Senate and the administration, between the Republicans and the Democrats, they can't find a way to rejigger the Budget Control Act limitations, and so they're using the OCO as kind of a relief valve to flow the kinds of money that the military actually needs to do what it's being asked to do.
Thank you. Mal, can we get a mic over to him, please?
Last weekend, my family and I were waited on by a naval corpsman. My question, I haven't seen that since the 90s. So my question is, what exactly has been happening to military pay?
Well, it's over since 9/11. It's been up dramatically, and I'm just off the top of my head 25% or something like that. I mean, I graduated from the Naval Academy in '85, so my experience was the '80s and '90s, and I retired in 2005. So post 9/11, there was a lot of flag waving, and all the politicians on Capitol Hill and the various patriotic groups, et cetera, wanted to show just how supportive they were of the American military. Hopefully to kill the ghost from Vietnam, right? I mean, we're still trying to slay that dragon. So there was this outpouring of support. You know, nothing is too good for the American serviceman and servicewoman that we're sending into harm's way. So we saw plus-ups in base pay. We saw expansion of various benefits to include family members, you know, economic or education opportunities and, you know, jobs on bases and those kinds of things. And it really ramped up. I guess maybe in the late 90s it started on that. There was this pay gap that was seen between skill sets within the military and the equivalent skill sets in the civilian world. And so in the late 90s there was an effort to try to narrow that gap. 9/11 happens, a lot of patriotism and flag waving, and we saw a real big push to up these pay and benefit kinds of packages. Okay, now on top of that, you got a lot of people getting hurt and killed, you know, because we're undertaking combat operations. So the medical care along with that, you know, it's a new crop of veterans that needed support through the Veterans Administration. Those that are still on active duty being handled by the military's active duty medical community, that kind of stuff, that was an increase in pay as well. So all of the services will say that even in those years when Congress was wanting to plus up compensation, the service chiefs are on record saying, we understand the good intent. We're telling you this is a long-term bill that we will not be able to sustain, you know, for 20 or 30 or 40 years. I mean, our mathematicians and economists and accountants can project those numbers out, and it will steadily erode the monies being put against defense. So I think that the message would be pay is pretty doggone good in the military, and the service chiefs would say it's taking up a half of all available defense spending, where they really want to better support the military community, the service people, by giving them the right equipment, you know, making sure they're trained and ready to go into harm's way. I mean, does that make sense? So to say, you know, we love the love, but your loving, you know, generous spirit is actually hurting us in the long run in the principal areas, and that's making sure we've got a military that can deploy and fight and win wars. So you're seeing a lot of support within the military community for compensation reform. Veterans organizations don't like it much at all because they see the erosion of post-service, you know, retirement benefits and military medical care through the VA and these other kinds of things, you know. So there's some debate going on in the community. I hope that answered the question.
Eric.
How much are we spending each year, the last few years, on nuclear infrastructure modernization?
It accounts for about 4% of DoD budget, and it should probably be double that. What we have found is that the physical infrastructure has been decaying for about 20 years. The last yield-producing experiment the U.S. undertook was in 1992, and that's when, you know, a total ban on all yield-producing stuff occurred. So all of the modeling, the surety inspections that go on, you know, if we talk about, I've got a delivery vehicle, and those are in pretty good shape, ICBMs and those kinds of things. The delivery vehicles are good. But to know that the bomb is actually going to go off and behave as advertised or expected is based on mathematical models.
What's 4% in terms of...
Well, if we did 500 billion, 10% would be 50 billion. Half of that is 2.5 billion or 25 billion. So my guess is probably in the $20 billion range. That's a back of the envelope kind of sketch, right? So the point that we came to in this, though, is that the assurances that we think we have in our nuclear capabilities are based on data and talent that was actually at work in the 70s and 80s, all right? So if you're wanting a good nuclear engineer coming into the field, they're going to go somewhere where they can really expand their research, you know, do some innovative and some exciting things. We have been completely static in the U.S. military nuclear field since the late 1980s. right? So there's no new talent coming in. So intellectual capital is eroding. The old guys are getting older. No new designs. Those have been frozen, whereas China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia are all, Pakistan, developing new things, and we don't even know what there is to discover because we're not investing. Physical infrastructure is in decline. It's not a good news story at all.
Do you have time for a couple more, Dakota? Okay, John and then George.
I have an idea. There's one place in the sequester where there's a trick where I think if people want to, we could get some money for real defense, which is there are some items in the military budget that aren't really military. For example, breast cancer research. And if somebody went through and tagged all those items,
That's been done.
the thing is to actually get them moved into the
Yeah.
civilian side, give them to HHS
Right.
or something.
So if you went to like, oh God, I just forgot his name, Oklahoma Senator? Coburn. Okay, so if you went to Coburn and went to some of these other studies, and you just took at face value every single program that's viewed as waste or inappropriately associated with the department, it would just barely amount to 1%.
Only one.
You know? So, I mean, 1% is 1%, right? But on a $500 billion budget, it's $5 billion. You know, so in the big scheme of things, yes, we should have things outside of defense that don't belong in defense. I completely agree with you. But when we're talking the numbers that we're talking about, new SSBN that we need to recapitalize, right? Carriers, launch vehicles, F-35 program at $200 million an airplane, right? That amount, it would be good, it's just not sufficient. So sequester was written, BCA was written very, very well, which means it's almost impossible to kill because of the linkages with entitlement, non-entitlement, discretionary, non-discretionary kinds of spending, and the political constituencies that come into that, right? So,
Last question, George.
or we got,
I'm sorry, and George, then Aaron, then we'll wrap it up.
Dakota, excellent brief.
Thank you.
You mentioned OCO. About 3 weeks ago, General Joe Votel, the SOCOM commander, testified on the Hill with Mike Lumpkin, the ASD SOLIC, and the question came up about impacts the sequestration is going to have on SOCOM, and what did they think of OCO? And they basically said that's only kicking the can down
It
the
is.
road because you can't use OCO funding. It's short-term, year by year.
Right.
You can't use it for procurement. You can't use it for RDT&E, so they were almost opposed to it. And it almost goes back to the thing that Sam Nunn did over at CSIS a few years ago. It was the national debt and national defense, and they basically had 10 former congressmen and senators.
right.
You remember he had the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they came up and said the only real solution to solve this is an 800-pound gorilla in the room. We've got to solve the revenue stream, we've got to solve the tax code, and we've got to solve entitlements. And until you fix that,
Right, and I would say that it's because that's the answer, that's why it's so difficult to do. It's easier to just take it from defense because when you look at the politics on Capitol Hill, farmers are going to cry out if you cut the farm subsidy. You know, the single mother with 5 kids, you know, needing some kind of financial welfare assistance or something, will cry foul and all. So when you look at the federal budget, and even on a good year, $500 billion in debt on that. So you look at where the debt actually comes from, and it's all non-defense things. I mean, it truly is the case. By 2020, we will spend more money servicing the national debt, paying the interest on the national debt, than on the entire Department of Defense budget. So the solution is non-DOD, but that's also the politically most difficult area, and that's why they can't fix it. Yes, ma'am.
Aaron?
Thank you very much for your presentation. There was a comment you made, and I can appreciate it very much, with regards to the Southern Hemisphere. The idea that drug cartels and what's coming across the southern border is more of a law enforcement issue. But I would offer up that environment or that area is rapidly changing.
Yes.
Because the major characters that you identify as national security threats, Russia, China, and the Mideast, all of those characters are swimming around in our southern hemisphere, in the Caribbean, and we're seeing those characters coming across the southern border. And very recently, this is not in the news yet. If it is, it's in a very limited way. There has been a tunnel recently discovered on the southern border, and it's noteworthy because it is extremely high-tech. Its length, its depth. It's not wide enough yet for trucks, but it is disturbing some of the national security agencies, and the Department of Homeland Security is trying to keep it quiet and want to hurry up and cover it up. So they're not quite sure what came through it other than drugs coming north and money going south. So is there no consideration of maybe altering our view? And also I'd offer up the comment by Marine Corps General Kelly of Southcom,
Yep.
identifying the region as an existential threat to the United States. So maybe we should kind of change our perspective.
Yeah, in the index, if you actually looked at it, there's a great website for it, heritage.org, just military index will bring it up. We have a great essay on Latin America, all right? And what we try to be very clear is we're talking the rationale for hard military power, carrier battle groups, missiles, heavy armor brigades, those kinds of things. How much military do you need? And we wanted to be very discerning in challenges that rise to the level in the assessed year to threaten vital U.S. national interests, all right? Because if we don't exercise that kind of discipline in this product, not getting at what you're talking about, then everything's a threat, and I'll never have enough capability for anything. So we've got a great essay that looks at both Africa and Latin America writ large, and we share your concerns. And in fact, when I was at CSBA a few years ago, 2 years of my life was spent looking at Latin America and drug cartels and destabilization of regions, undermining of governments, good governance, law and order, all that stuff. The drug industry alone is $35 billion a year in hard currency that goes into that. Doesn't account for contraband, weapons movement, human trafficking, any of that stuff. Iran has been in bed with Venezuela. The Attorney General up in New York talked about that quite a bit some years ago, right? We're seeing Chinese trade relationships with Argentina for beef, it's another protein source and all that stuff. Russian mafia, the Chinese triads. So you're right, there's a huge thing. There's also a credible Hezbollah presence in the tri-border area of South America, and a lot of the drug money will go to fund terrorist activities in the Middle East. So we're aware of those linkages, but what we do, again, on a year-by-year basis is assess the conditions of that year relative to vital national interest and how that translates into a need or relevance to hard military power. So if this year or next year or future years these challenges rose to that level, then they would break through that threshold and we would address them in that chapter rather than an essay. But we do have a lot of other things that go on to talk about exactly what you're talking about. And I would actually add that I think the border area between the U.S. and Canada is probably more worrisome because it's much more porous and it gets a lot less attention. And it's easier to move from Europe through Canada into the U.S. than it is going through Latin America and coming up. Although some of the ethnic characteristics, whether it's skin color or whatever, you can blend into some of the Latin America populations, just from a stereotyping kind of view. And there have been these covered, protected transportation networks where third-party national kind of folks have been picked up. So it is an issue. I don't view it as an existential threat unless you looked at a 20 or 30-year time horizon. But it's our largest trading partner. It's our biggest cultural thing. If you look at the largest growing demographic in the U.S., it's a Hispanic Latin American community. So we didn't ignore it. We're just saying that in this product, with this particular project, we were looking hard military power against top-level threats and left it at that.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, Dakota, thank you.